Underestimated and blatantly cheated, I crafted cold revenge and took control, protecting Salaries. My name is Tessa Marlowe. I am 35 years old, and tonight I am a ghost at a feast held in my own honor, though no one at this table knows it yet. We walked through the lobby of the Glass Court Hotel, a palace of steel and muted light in the heart of Ravenport. The carpets were a deep cerulean blue, so thick they swallowed the sound of my heels. The air was heavy with the scent of old money, polished oak, expensive leather, and the faint floral perfume of the other wives. We were led to a private dining room, long and narrow, dominated by a single mahogany table set for 20. This was Victor Hale's inner circle, the high priests of Kingswell Dynamics, and I was here as the +1 of Grant Wilder, my husband, their competent but not quite essential director of mid-level strategy. Grant's hand rested on the small of my back, a proprietary gesture that felt more like a restraint than affection. He was nervous. I could feel the slight tremor in his fingertips through the silk of my dress. He'd spent the entire car ride coaching me. Just smile, Tess. Let them lead the conversation. These are important people. What he meant was, don't embarrass me, don't be yourself. I gave him the smile he wanted, a placid, agreeable curve of the lips that revealed nothing. It was a mask I had perfected over years of sitting in boardrooms, listening to men explain my own ideas back to me. We took our seats. I was placed between Grant and the wife of the CFO, a woman named Eleanor, whose face was a smooth, unmoving testament to her dermatologist's skill. The clatter of silverware on porcelain was a delicate, constant percussion beneath the low hum of conversation. The chandeliers above cast a warm, golden light, making the diamonds on the women's wrists glitter like captive stars. It was all a performance, a carefully staged play of power and influence, and everyone knew their lines. The first course arrived, a scallop seared and resting on a swirl of green puree. The wine was poured, a crisp Sancerre. It was then that Victor Hale, the CEO, decided it was time for his opening act. He stood, his 6'3" frame commanding the room. He was a man who had never been told no, and it showed in the easy, entitled way he occupied space. "To Kingswell," he began, his voice a booming baritone that cut through the chatter. The table quieted instantly. "To another quarter of crushing the competition, to the men in this room who make it happen." He took a sip from his glass, his eyes sweeping over the faces of his subordinates, each one looking back with a carefully calibrated expression of admiration. Then his gaze landed on Grant, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "And to the families that support us," he continued, his eyes flicking to me. "I hear Grant's lovely wife is playing at her own little venture these days. A little startup, isn't that right, Grant? Something to keep her busy." The laughter started as a low chuckle and swelled into a wave of masculine amusement. It wasn't cruel, not overtly. It was dismissive, the kind of laughter reserved for a child's charming but foolish ambitions. They were laughing at the very idea of me, the little woman with her little hobby. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a tide of pure, unadulterated rage that I immediately suppressed. Control is everything. I learned that in my old life. Grant didn't look at me. He stared down into his wineglass, his knuckles white as he gripped the stem. He swirled the liquid, watching the vortex as if it held the answers to the universe. A faint, tight smile was plastered on his face. He was swimming in the shark tank, and he would not, under any circumstances, risk bleeding, not even for me. His silence was a betrayal sharper than any word. Eleanor, the CFO's wife, leaned toward me, her voice a conspiratorial whisper laced with condescension. "Sweetheart, don't you worry about all this." She patted my hand with fingers cold from the weight of her rings. "Tonight is for the big numbers. Let the men handle it." The women around her offered small, sympathetic smiles. They were part of the club, the silent partners in their husbands' success, their own ambitions packed away in mothballs like old wedding dresses. They saw me as one of them, just a bit newer to the game. They were wrong. I gave Eleanor a serene smile of my own. "Of course," I said, my voice even and calm. I took a sip of water. The glass was cool and heavy in my hand. Inside my black leather clutch, resting against my thigh, was a single folded document. It was a letter of assignment and assumption executed this afternoon by the legal team at Blue Alder Bank. It confirmed, in dense, impenetrable legalese, the transfer of a $240 million senior secured term loan. The debt that kept Kingswell Dynamics afloat now belonged not to the bank, but to a specially created entity named Rookite Acquisition LLC, an SPV, a ghost. My ghost. Rookite was wholly owned by Rookite Holdings, which was in turn owned by my little startup, Glass Key Labs. They were laughing at a mouse, unaware it had just swallowed the title deed to their house. I glanced up at the ornate grandfather clock in the corner of the room. The polished brass pendulum swung back and forth, a patient, relentless metronome. The long hand pointed to the 8, the short hand just past the 7:42 p.m. in 3 minutes. At precisely 7:45 p.m., a scheduled email would be delivered to the personal inboxes of every independent member of the Kingswell Dynamics Board of Directors. It would not go to Victor or his CFO. It would bypass them completely. The email contained a bear hug letter, a non-binding but deeply serious offer to purchase all operating assets of the company. It also contained a detailed presentation outlining the catastrophic consequences of refusal. The main course was served, a fillet of beef with a dark, rich sauce. The sommelier poured a heavy Cabernet. The piano player in the adjoining room, who had been playing a light, unobtrusive melody, shifted into a minor key. The music was suddenly melancholic, almost mournful, a fitting requiem. I took a bite of the steak. The sauce had a sharp, surprising note of lemon in it. The acidity hit my tongue, a tiny, pleasant shock that made the nerve endings tingle. I focused on the sensation, etching it into my memory. This was the taste of the moment just before, the quiet intake of breath before the plunge. Every detail had to be recorded, logged, and stored. I leaned slightly toward Grant, my voice a murmur meant only for him. "Little startup, huh?" Victor Hale across the table caught the whisper. He couldn't have heard the words, but he saw the challenge in my eyes. A smirk touched his lips. He was enjoying this, the taming of Grant's upstart wife. Under the table, Grant's hand shot out and his fingers closed around my forearm. A silent, desperate plea. "Stop. Please don't do this to me." His grip was surprisingly strong. I didn't pull away. I simply let my arm go limp in his grasp, a dead weight he could not control. I looked away from him, back toward the clock. 7:44 p.m. 1 minute. My phone resting in my lap beneath my napkin was already unlocked. My thumb hovered over the screen. It was a single-word draft, waiting to be sent to my transaction lawyer, Mara Colson. She was standing by, her team assembled, ready to execute a dozen pre-planned steps the second she received the signal. I met Victor's gaze across the expanse of white linen and crystal. He raised his glass to me in a mock toast, the smug king of his castle. I gave him a small, tight smile. The clock began to chime the 3/4 hour. Under the table, I pressed send. The word was proceed. The word hung in the digital ether for a fraction of a second before vanishing. Proceed. Grant's fingers were still clamped on my arm, a futile anchor in a storm he couldn't see. Across the table, Victor Hale was telling a story about a golf trip to Pebble Beach, his voice slick with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was the master of his own universe. They were all still laughing. They had no idea the world had just tilted on its axis. They saw Tessa Marlowe, the wife, the quiet, elegantly dressed accessory. They didn't see the woman I used to be, and they certainly didn't see the woman I had become. 2 years ago, my official title was Senior Vice President, Head of Digital Risk Control for Unisphere Assurance, one of the largest insurance conglomerates on the planet. My job wasn't to create products or drive sales. My job was to be the corporate boogeyman. I led a team of forensic analysts and data scientists, and we hunted for ghosts in the machine. We dissected hundreds of millions of software contracts, looking for the single line of code that could expose the company to catastrophic liability. We stress-tested digital infrastructure to find the one vulnerability a hacker could exploit. My world was a landscape of hypotheticals, of potential disasters, of risks so vast they could sink a Fortune 500 company. I learned to think in terms of structural integrity. I learned to spot the hairline crack in the foundation before anyone else even knew there was a building. and then I walked away. I didn't leave for a competitor. I didn't leave to spend more time with my family. I left because I saw a flaw, not just in Unisphere's systems, but in the very fabric of how modern business was conducted. Companies were signing complex, multi-layered financial and service agreements and then promptly forgetting the specifics of what they'd signed. They tracked their obligations on spreadsheets, relying on human diligence to monitor covenants and clauses. It was like building a skyscraper and then hiring a security guard to walk around and check for fires. It was archaic. It was inefficient. It was a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. So I built the exploit, or rather, I built the cure, and then decided to sell it as a weapon. I founded Glass Key Labs from a small leased office with gray walls and a view of a brick alleyway. The concept was simple, but its execution was brutally complex. Glass Key built a proprietary platform that ingested, standardized, and analyzed contractual data. It didn't just digitize contracts, it mapped their DNA. Our software could read a 10,000-page credit agreement and in real time alert a client the second a counterparty was approaching a covenant breach. It was a lie detector for balance sheets. From the very beginning, I designed the business for anonymity. Power is most effective when its source is unknown. Glass Key Labs Inc. was the parent, the brain. It was the visible entity, though I kept its public profile deliberately low. Beneath it, I established Rookite Holdings, a Delaware-based holding company. It was a firewall, a legal and financial air gap, and for this specific operation, Rookite Holdings created a special purpose vehicle, a disposable corporate entity named Rookite Acquisition LLC. 3 layers of separation, a nesting doll of legal entities designed to ensure that when the final doll was opened, the face inside would be a complete surprise. We didn't chase venture capital. I funded the seed round myself with the money I had made at Unisphere, money Grant thought was sitting in a portfolio of boring index funds. He knew about Glass Key, of course. He just didn't understand it. I remember the night I told him, spreading my initial business plan across our marble kitchen island. He'd scanned the documents, his eyes glazing over at the talk of data architecture and SAS models. He smiled, the same indulgent smile he'd given his niece showing him a crayon drawing. "This is great, Tess. Really," he'd said, patting my shoulder. "It's good for you to have a project. Just have fun with it." The words had echoed in my mind for 2 years. They were the fuel. A week later, when we were finalizing our prenuptial agreement, my lawyer insisted on a clause explicitly defining Glass Key and all its future assets as my separate and sole property. Grant hadn't blinked. "Of course," he'd said with a wave of his hand, "whatever you and your little startup make is all yours." He thought he was being generous. In reality, he was signing away a kingdom he didn't even know existed. For the first year, I operated in complete stealth. I erased my LinkedIn profile. I turned down conference invitations. I did no PR. The only metric I cared about, the only thing that was real, was cash flow. We didn't chase growth for growth's sake. We chased contracts. Our first clients weren't flashy tech firms. They were hungry, unsentimental private debt funds. They didn't care about our brand. They cared about results. They used our platform on a white label basis, integrating our analytics into their own risk management systems. We were their secret weapon, the ghost in their machine. It was through one of these clients that I found Kingswell Dynamics. They weren't our client. Their lender, Blue Alder Bank, was. The fund had purchased a piece of Kingswell's syndicated loan on the secondary market, and as part of their due diligence, they ran the entire credit agreement through our system, my system, and it lit up like a Christmas tree. The algorithm flagged a dozen minor inconsistencies, but one stood out, a poorly worded springing liquidity covenant tied to a series of satellite agreements with conflicting effective dates. It was a typo, a mistake, a hairline crack in a $240 million foundation. From that moment, Kingswell Dynamics was my target. The habits I'd built at Unisphere became my operational doctrine. Say as little as possible, sign in the correct place, log everything. My goal was never to build a company that would be celebrated on the cover of Forbes. My goal was to prove a point Grant and Victor Hale and every man in this room could never grasp, that true scale isn't measured by the number of employees you have or the square footage of your office. It's measured by the authority you can exert over a balance sheet. Power isn't having a seat at the table. It's owning the table, the chairs, and the building therein. Only one person in the world knew the full scope of my plan: Mara Coulson, my transaction lawyer. She was a small, ferociously intelligent woman who saw the law not as a set of rules, but as a weapon system. My own engineers at Glass Key knew they were building a powerful analysis engine, but they didn't know its ultimate target. My finance team saw cash flows from white-label contracts, but they didn't know the identity of the end users. Everyone had their piece of the puzzle. Only Mara and I could see the whole picture. For 6 months, we quietly, methodically built our position. We used Rookite to approach Blue Alder Bank, not as a competitor, but as a neutral third-party financial entity interested in acquiring a portion of their loan portfolio. Banks are always looking to offload risk with a slight discount. They were happy to sell us 51% of Kingswell's senior debt and, with it, the coveted position of administrative agent. The agent is the quarterback of a syndicated loan. The agent communicates with the borrower. The agent calls the shots. The final piece fell into place today. This afternoon, while Grant was in a meeting optimizing synergy, I was on a conference call with Mara and the legal team from Blue Alder. At precisely 5:03 p.m., I received the email with the executed PDF, the assignment of loan and security agreement, signed, sealed, delivered. The key was in my hand the entire time. Grant thought I was at a yoga class. Back at the dinner table, the filet was gone. The wine glasses refilled. Victor Hale was laughing again, his face ruddy in the golden light. Grant was finally looking at me, a flicker of unease in his eyes. He must have sensed the shift in my posture, the subtle change in the atmosphere that only he, after years of marriage, might detect. He opened his mouth to say something, probably another warning to behave, but it was too late. Miles away, in the data centers that hosted the board members' email servers, a message was arriving, a message from a company they had never heard of, a message that was about to turn their entire world upside down. I picked up my wine glass. The deep red liquid swirled gently. The piano music had stopped. In the sudden silence, the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed impossibly loud. The conversation at the table had resumed its comfortable, self-congratulatory rhythm. The CFO was explaining the tax advantages of a new offshore subsidiary. Victor was nodding, adding a comment about regulatory capture. They were rearranging deck chairs on a ship that, for all intents and purposes, was already underwater. They just didn't feel the cold yet. My phone remained dark in my lap, its task complete. Now there was only the waiting and the knowing. The foundation of my trap was not elegant or exotic. It was brutally simple, built from the kind of boring boilerplate language that executives like Victor Hale pay lawyers millions to draft and then never bother to read themselves. It all centered on their primary line of credit, a $240 million term loan B. Think of it as a massive reservoir of water that keeps the entire Kingswell ecosystem alive. Buried deep in the 500 pages of the credit agreement was a single paragraph, Section 6.12b. It was a springing liquidity covenant, a simple promise. It stipulated that the company's unrestricted cash on hand, tested quarterly, must never fall below $45 million. If it did, the dam cracked. A default would be triggered, giving the lender, now me, a host of terrifying new powers. At their last quarterly filing, Kingswell had reported $47 million in cash, $2 million of breathing room, a rounding error for a company this size. It was a number designed to soothe investors, but to my system, it was a screaming red alert. I had heard Grant mention with a note of pride in his voice that Victor had just secured a huge new contract. "He's telling the board it'll push our cash position north of 60, Grant had said, oblivious. But I had Glass Key pull the public filings. It wasn't a contract. It was a memorandum of understanding, a corporate promise ring. It was non-binding, unenforceable, and generated zero in actual revenue. It was a bluff, a piece of paper Victor was waving to keep the wolves at bay. The truth was, the reservoir was leaking. I knew their core data provider, a critical vendor without whom their entire platform would grind to a halt, had demanded a 30% price increase. Kingswell's CFO, the man now pontificating about tax havens, had stalled them, begging for 30 more days. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, juggling payables and stretching receivables, desperately trying to keep the water level above the line. But the pressure was building while their leadership was focused on the headline numbers. My software was crawling through the fine print of their ancillary agreements, the smaller contracts, the vendor agreements, the real estate leases, and it found something beautiful. In 12 separate, seemingly unrelated contracts, it found a most favored lender clause. It's a simple piece of contractual vanity. It says, if you ever give a different lender a better, sweeter deal than you gave me, I get that same deal too, automatically. Over the years, in their rush to secure financing and partnerships, Kingswell had handed out these contractual copycats left and right. Then came the detonator. It was an addendum to a service agreement from 6 years ago for a software package they no longer even used, a fossil buried in their digital archives. The addendum contained a minor amendment, but the lawyer who drafted it had made a mistake, a typo. He had written the effective date as 2026 instead of 2016. A meaningless, harmless error that no human would ever notice. But my system didn't see it as a typo. It saw it as a temporal paradox, a contract that was legally active 2 years in the future. This single misplaced digit gave me the opening I needed. In the world of corporate law, you can trigger a material adverse change, a MAC clause, simply by asking a question you know your counterparty cannot answer cleanly. The moment I, as the new administrative agent for their debt, sent a formal inquiry asking them to legally clarify the operational status of an agreement with a future effective date, their own internal compliance and legal teams would be forced to concede that their contractual records were flawed. That would be a MAC, a small one, but a MAC nonetheless. And here is where the dominoes begin to fall. The terms of my debt agreement stated that upon any material adverse change, the lender had the right to demand enhanced oversight, and the most favored lender clauses in those 12 other contracts meant that they all inherited that right along with me. This chain reaction gave me the ultimate power, the right to invoke cash dominion. Cash dominion is a phrase that makes CFOs wake up screaming in the middle of the night. I explained it once to Mara in the simplest terms I could. Imagine every cent your company earns from every single customer no longer goes into your bank account. Instead, it is automatically swept every single night into a new account, an account that I, the lender, control. If you want to make payroll, you have to submit a formal request to me. If you want to pay an electricity bill, you ask me. If you want to buy staples for the office, you fill out a form and hope I approve it. I become the gatekeeper of every dollar that flows in or out. Your company is still yours, but the cash, its lifeblood, is mine to command. And per the terms of the agreement, a covenant breach, such as the one I was about to force, gave me the right to trigger cash dominion with 24 hours' notice. Once cash dominion is in place, my bear hug letter is no longer a hostile offer. It's a rescue mission. It's the only viable path forward. The choice is no longer should we sell to this mysterious entity. The choice becomes, do we accept this lifeline, or do we let the company suffocate in 48 hours? I wasn't offering to buy their company. I was offering them a structured, orderly way to save their employees and their assets from the consequences of their own incompetence. The beauty of it was its speed. While Victor and his team were still trying to figure out who Rookite Acquisition even was, the gears would already be turning. I had already, through Mara's firm, scheduled a team of auditors. They were to be at Kingswell's main asset warehouse, a sprawling facility out at Purfield, at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, not to ask permission, but to begin a full inventory of the secured collateral, as was my right under the loan agreement. While these men were still sleeping off their expensive wine, my people would be on their property with clipboards and legal authority, counting every server, every desk, every asset that guaranteed my loan, all of it. The corporate shell companies, the purchased debt, the power to seize control of their entire treasury, the army of auditors ready to march at dawn. It all grew from a single seed, a footnote on page 87 of an attachment to a forgotten contract, a single sentence they had approved without a thought. A decade ago, they thought power was in the booming voice at the head of the table. They never understood that true power was in the silent, patient reading of the fine print, and no one read the fine print better than I did. The architecture of this night was built on 3 pillars of leverage, each designed to support the next. It wasn't a gamble. It was a siege planned and executed with the cold precision of a military campaign. As I sat there, feigning interest in a story about quarterly earnings projections, my mind was a quiet command center, reviewing the blueprints of the machine I had set in motion. Every gear was turning exactly as it should. The first pillar, the foundation of the entire structure, was debt. 6 months ago, Kingswell Dynamics was just a name on a list of potential opportunities to attack. I needed a seat at their table, not in their dining room, but in their capital stack. So I went to their bank. Blue Alder was holding a significant portion of the company's $240 million syndicated loan, and like most large banks, they were always looking to de-risk and free up capital. Through my SPV, Rookite Acquisition, I made them an offer. I would buy 51% of their position, the majority stake. I offered to pay cash and I offered to close quickly. They saw a clean, simple transaction. I saw the throne. Because I was taking a majority position, the title of administrative agent came with the deal. The agent is the designated point of contact, the enforcer of covenants, the hand that holds the whip. And because my glass key software had shown me the rot deep inside Kingswell's financials, I knew Blue Alder secretly considered the loan to be distressed. I leveraged that unspoken fear, and they agreed to sell me the debt at a 31% discount to its face value. I had not only bought control, I had bought it at a bargain. The second pillar was contract. Acquiring the debt gave me power, but the existing agreements gave me a weapon. My team at Glass Key had spent months mapping the tangled web of Kingswell's legal obligations. The most favored lender clauses were the key. Once I was in the driver's seat as the administrative agent, I could trigger the material adverse change using the typo in that forgotten addendum. That event would grant me new enhanced rights, and the MFL clauses acted like a magnet, pulling those same rights from my agreement and applying them to the 12 other contracts scattered throughout their business. It was a cascade failure by design. One smallest controlled breach would create a legal shockwave, consolidating a dozen disparate points of leverage directly into my hands. It turned me from a simple creditor into the contractual center of their universe. The third pillar was brand, or more accurately, the complete lack of one. Rookite Acquisition LLC was a ghost. Its name was chosen with deliberate care. A rook in chess moves with unstoppable linear force. It is what you shine into dark corners to expose decay. The name meant nothing to them, but it meant everything to me. It had no public record, no website, no connection to Glass Key Labs, and certainly no connection to Tessa Marlowe. When the board members opened their emails tonight, they wouldn't see the CEO's golf buddy's wife. They would see a mysterious, unknown, and therefore intimidating financial entity that had seemingly out of nowhere acquired control of their company's fate. Anonymity is its own form of power. With these pillars in place, the operational phase was a matter of timing. Every step was pre-scripted. On Mara Coulson's secure server, a folder labeled KD Execute contained a series of drafted legal notices. The first was the notice of cash dominion. It was ready to be sent. My instructions to her were explicit. It was not to be transmitted until after I left this dinner. Its terms were set to become legally effective at the stroke of midnight. They would go to sleep tonight as executives. They would wake up tomorrow morning as supplicants. Also in that folder was the contingency plan. The final turn of the screw, a drafted Article 9 sale notice. If for some reason the board chose to fight, this notice would be their death warrant. Under the Uniform Commercial Code, as the senior secured creditor, I had the right to foreclose on the assets that collateralized the loan, which was basically everything they owned, and sell them at public auction. It is a messy, brutal, and value-destructive process. The mere existence of that drafted notice, which I had instructed Mara to mention on her first call with their general counsel, would be enough to show them that this was not a negotiation. It was a surrender. But I wasn't just planning a demolition. I was planning a reconstruction. The day before yesterday, Mara had finalized vendor standstill agreements with Kingswell's 3 most critical technology suppliers. They were the ones the CFO was currently stalling. I offered them a simple deal, agree not to suspend service for the next 48 hours, and in return, the moment I took control of the treasury, their overdue invoices would be paid in full immediately. They all signed. I had just secured the company's operational continuity while its own leadership was sipping Cabernet, completely unaware their supply chain had already switched its allegiance. The Bear Hug package itself was a masterpiece of strategic generosity. It was an asset purchase agreement, not a stock purchase. This was critical. It meant I was buying the good parts of the company, the technology, the client lists, the employees, while leaving the toxic shell with all its potential legal liabilities behind for the shareholders to fight over. My offer was firm. We would retain all core personnel below the C-suite. Victor Hale was to resign effective immediately with no golden parachute. In exchange for a swift, clean transfer, Ruckheit would provide a mutual release, meaning we would not sue him or the board for mismanagement. And to remove any doubt about our seriousness, I had secured a co-financing term sheet from North Harbor Capital, a well-respected private equity fund known for its aggressive but successful turnaround projects. They were on standby, ready to wire the necessary funds to complete the transaction. Their involvement served two purposes. It proved our offer was real, and it put the board on a brutally short clock. The term sheet expired in 24 hours. The delivery system for this poison pill was just as important as its ingredients. The detailed presentation, the offer letter, the summary of North Harbor's backing, the entire package had been emailed at exactly 7:45 p.m., not to Victor or his CFO, but directly to the 5 independent members of the board of directors at their personal email addresses. I was surgically excising the leadership. I was speaking directly to the people whose fiduciary duty was to the company, not to the man at the head of the table. Everything was on a timer. The email, the notice, the standstill agreements, the financing, all of it was automated, pre-planned, and now unstoppable. My work was done. All that was left for me to do was sit here, listen to their empty laughter, and finish my medium-rare steak. The waiters had cleared the main course, their movement silent and efficient. A low, satisfied hum filled the room, the sound of men who had eaten well and felt secure in their place in the world. Victor Hale, his face flushed with wine and victory, pushed his chair back and rose, holding his glass aloft. He tapped it with a fork, the clear, ringing chime demanding their final sycophantic attention. "One more," he announced, his voice booming in the suddenly quiet room. "To the future of Kingswell Dynamics, which has never been brighter." He paused, letting his gaze drift over the faces of his lieutenants before settling with deliberate, patronizing focus on me. "And to the pretty little dreams of our wives, may they always keep them busy and keep us inspired." The table erupted in appreciative laughter. It was the last full-throated, genuine laugh of the night. I didn't smile. I met his gaze from across the table and held it. I lifted my own glass of water, the condensation cool against my fingertips. "Pretty little dreams," I said, my voice just loud enough to cut through the fading chuckles. "Often have claws." A few people who heard me shifted uncomfortably. Victor's smile tightened into a smirk. He was about to make a retort when a sharp electronic buzzing sound cut through the air. It was the landline, a black Cisco phone on a credenza by the door, an object so archaic it felt like a prop. An assistant, a young man with a perpetually worried expression, scurried in to answer it. He listened for a moment, his face paling. He then crossed the room and bent down to whisper urgently into Victor's ear. Victor waved him away with a flick of his wrist, his annoyance plain. The assistant retreated, the sound of his leather soles squeaking softly on the polished floor. Beside me, I felt Grant's hand clamp down on my wrist, his grip surprisingly tight. "Tessa," he hissed, his voice a low, frantic whisper. "Don't make this difficult for me tonight, please." His panic was a living thing radiating from his touch. I looked down at his fingers, then back up at his desperate eyes. I slowly, deliberately pulled my hand from his grasp. The air felt cold on my skin where he had held me. A second sound pierced the renewed quiet, a low, insistent vibration. It was Victor's cell phone, lying face down on the mahogany table. He snatched it up, his expression shifting from irritation to anger. "What is it now?" he barked into the phone. He listened. The room was so still I could hear the faint, tiny voice of the caller on the other end. Victor's posture changed. He went rigid, his back straightening as if he'd received an electric shock. He stood up from his chair, turning his back to the table. "What bear hug?" he said, his voice a choked whisper. "Who the hell is this?" He took 2 steps away from the table, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. At the same time, the CFO, a man named Marcus Thorne, glanced down at a text message that had just illuminated his own phone's screen. His jovial, wine-flushed face slackened into a mask of confusion. He read the message twice, then leaned over to the man beside him. The company's COO. Our admin agent, Marcus whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. Blue Alder just notified us. They've assigned the loan. The new agent is a company called Rookite Acquisition. The name passed down the table like a contagion. Whispers. Rookite. Who's Rookite? A mid-level manager sitting near the end of the long table, a man I knew Grant was desperate to impress, murmured the question into the charged silence. Rook? Who the hell is Rook? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I stared down into my half-empty wine glass. A single tiny bubble detached from the bottom, rising slowly through the deep red liquid before breaking silently on the surface. Victor stumbled back to the table, his face a mottled canvas of rage and confusion. He threw his phone down, the plastic clattering loudly against the wood. He forced a laugh, but it was a brittle, ugly sound, some kind of cheap PR stunt, he snarled, looking at no one in particular. Some bottom feeder trying to make a name for themselves. I met his frantic gaze and offered him nothing but a slow, deliberate shrug. The gesture seemed to enrage him more than any words could have. Then the world changed. It happened with a series of quiet, synchronized chimes around the table. Wrists lit up, Apple Watches glowing in the dim golden light. I saw the man next to Grant stare at his wrist, his eyes widening. Then the COO, then two more men down the table. The notification was stark against the black screens, printed in a clean sans serif font. Notice of special board meeting, 7:52 p.m. The air in the room became thin, difficult to breathe. The casual, confident sprawl of the men tightened. They sat up straighter, their bodies tensing. The golden, celebratory light from the chandeliers suddenly felt harsh, like the glare of an interrogation lamp. Every ounce of warmth and camaraderie had evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fear. The sound of their breathing was now audible. I picked up my heavy linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table beside my plate. The action was deliberate, final. I looked down the long, silent table at the faces of the powerful men of Kingswell Dynamics. Then I looked at the piece of perfectly cooked beef sitting untouched on Victor Hale's plate. We shouldn't let the main course get cold, I said, my voice perfectly level. Victor was the first to find his voice. It was hoarse, shredded with a rage that was so pure it was almost theatrical. He lunged to his feet, knocking his chair backward with a crash. He pointed a trembling finger across the table, not at me, but at the empty space beside me, as if I were a specter he couldn't bear to look at directly. This is illegal, he bellowed, his voice cracking. This is extortion. You can't use debt as a weapon. I'll have you in court for the next 10 years. I'll sue you into the ground. He was screaming at his own general counsel, a man named Peters, who was on the other end of a frantic phone call. Peters listened to Victor's tirade, then spoke quietly into the phone. He nodded, his face grim. He turned to Victor, holding the phone out as if it were a venomous snake. It's their counsel, he said, his voice flat. She has a message for you. Peters cleared his throat and recited the words with the weary tone of a messenger delivering a death sentence. Rookite Acquisition is a creditor exercising its legal and contractual rights. This is not a negotiation. The words hung in the air, cold and absolute. A creditor, not a competitor, not a corporate raider. A creditor. The statement was a brick wall. Victor stared, his mouth opening and closing silently, no sound coming out. In the ensuing chaos, Grant leaned toward me, his face ashen. His voice was a pathetic, broken whisper, a sound I had never heard from him before. Tess, I might have mentioned your presentation deck to Marcus, the CFO, back in March. He couldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the tablecloth, at a small breadcrumb near my plate. I was just trying to show him how smart you were. A sharp physical pain shot through my chest, a needle of ice. It was one thing to be underestimated. It was another to be used. He hadn't just failed to defend me. He had taken my work, my mind, and offered it up as a party trick to impress his boss. My face, however, remained a placid mask. He didn't know the truth. He couldn't possibly know. I had anticipated his weakness, his desperate need for approval. The presentation I had left on our shared home server, the one I knew he would eventually discover, was a decoy. It was a carefully crafted piece of misdirection, a Trojan horse. The deck outlined a plausible but deeply flawed strategy for optimizing vendor contracts, subtly encouraging the user to consolidate terms under a specific type of addendum. An addendum that contained language so disadvantageous, so restrictive that its execution was in itself an act of gross managerial negligence. And Marcus Thorne, the CFO, had taken the bait. He'd used my flawed logic to bully a key supplier into signing that very addendum 2 months ago. The document now logged in their system was my Exhibit A, the irrefutable proof of the Mac event that unlocked all my other powers. Grant hadn't just shown them my work. He had personally handed them the shovel to dig their own graves. Across the table, Marcus was furiously typing on his phone. He was in damage control mode, trying to calm the panicked board members who were no doubt blowing up his inbox. He showed his screen to Victor, a desperate attempt to rally. "It's fine," he hissed. "I've emailed the board. Our liquidity is fine. The covenant is not breached. We're at 47 million. This is all a bluff." I watched him lie. Then I pulled out my own phone. As the new administrative agent, I had been granted real-time, read-only access to their master treasury account that morning. It was a standard right they had approved without a second thought. I opened the banking portal. The number on the screen glowed in the dim light, $44,612,810.24. They had dipped below the threshold sometime this afternoon after processing a wire transfer to an overseas supplier. They were in breach and they didn't even know it. I took a screenshot. I attached it to a new email. The recipient was the lead independent director of the Kingswell board. The subject line was "for your immediate attention." I added no text. The screenshot was enough. I hit send. Less than a minute later, the COO's Apple Watch lit up again. He read the message, and all the blood drained from his face. He looked at Victor, his expression one of utter defeat. Victor's phone buzzed. He looked down. He saw the same message, a forward from their own lead counsel. Its text was brutally concise. "Springing liquidity covenant is breached. Cash dominion is likely enforceable. Advise immediate cooperation." Victor Hale looked like he had been turned to stone. Grant saw the look on his CEO's face and finally understood the game was over. He turned back to me, his eyes swimming with tears. "Tessa," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Tessa, I'm begging you, please don't do this." In my mind, a memory flashed sharp and clear. The two of us a year ago in my home office. I was trying to explain the potential scale of Glass Key. He had listened, that same indulgent smile on his face. "It's a great little business, honey," he'd said, closing my laptop. "But you have to understand, women just don't get scale." My own phone began to vibrate, a calm, steady pulse against my palm. The caller ID was a blocked number, but I knew who it was. I answered. "M. Marlowe." A crisp, professional voice said, "It was Julian Croft, the managing partner at North Harbor Capital. Just confirming we are ready. The press release announcing our financial backing of the Rookite asset purchase is drafted. We can release it to the wires the moment you give us the signal." "Thank you, Julian," I said calmly. "Stand by." I hung up. I looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. Its hands pointed to 8:11 p.m. I opened the secure app from Mara's firm. A single document awaited my signature, notice of cash dominion trigger. I pressed my thumb to the screen. The biometric sensor flashed green. A second later, the document was replaced by a confirmation message. A single underlined hyperlink glowed on my screen. Rookite KWD concentration account. It was active. It was mine. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. I took a sip of water and set the heavy crystal glass down on the mahogany table. In the dead silence of the room, the sound was as sharp and final as a judge's gavel. I turned my head, ignoring my husband, ignoring the broken CEO. I looked directly at Eleanor, Victor's wife, the woman who had told me to let the men talk big numbers. I gave her a small, polite, serene smile. "I think I'm ready for dessert now," I said. My request for dessert was met with a stunned, dead silence. The CEO's wife, Eleanor, simply stared at me, her mouth slightly agape, the practiced social graces of a lifetime deserting her completely. The air in the room was thick and heavy, a toxic cocktail of fear and disbelief. The real battle was no longer here in this overheated dining room. It was happening in the digital ether in a cascade of notifications, alerts, and panicked messages. The machine was running now, and all we could do was watch the warning lights flash one by one. 8:14 p.m. Marcus Thorne, the CFO, let out a small, strangled gasp. He was staring at an email alert on his phone, his face the color of old parchment. "Lockbox," he stammered, looking at Victor. "Our main receivables lockbox. The approval authority has been reassigned, effective immediately per administrative agent directive." A few of the men at the table understood. Most didn't, but they understood the terror in the CFO's voice. I knew exactly what the alert meant. From this moment forward, every dollar paid to Kingswell Dynamics by its customers, millions per day, was being automatically swept into the concentration account controlled by Rookite. The company's revenue stream had been diverted. I had just turned off their water. 8:22 p.m. The COO's phone buzzed with a text message. It was his head of operations. He read it aloud in a monotone, his voice hollowed out. "Our core data provider just confirmed receipt of the standstill notice. They will not be suspending our service." A flicker of hope appeared in Victor's eyes and was just as quickly extinguished. The COO continued, "But they state that, per the agreement, all future payment instructions and approvals must now come directly from Rookite Acquisition." The message was clear. Their most critical supplier no longer recognized their authority. They were executives in name only. 8:31 p.m. A new email notification lit up the watches of the two independent board members in the room. One of them, a stern-faced man named Caldwell, read the message preview, and his eyes narrowed. He looked directly at Marcus Thorne, his voice like chipping ice. "Marcus, I have a formal inquiry here from the head of our audit committee. She wants to know who authorized the pricing addendum with the Hexagon data contract, the one signed in April. She's flagging it as having unfavorable and asymmetrical terms." All eyes turned to the CFO. It was the addendum from my decoy deck, the time bomb I had planted months ago. Marcus Thorne opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a fish drowning on dry land. His silence was an admission of guilt. 8:38 p.m. Caldwell didn't wait for an answer. He looked at the other board member, a woman named Chen Jones, and they exchanged a brief, decisive nod. The coup was silent and swift. Caldwell stood up, his napkin placed neatly on the table. "Mr. Peters," he said, addressing their general counsel, "Ms. Chen Jones and I are formally requesting an executive session of the board to be convened as soon as possible." He paused, his gaze sweeping over Victor and the CFO. "Management, of course, will be excluded." Victor Hale visibly flinched as if he'd been struck. It was a public shiv delivered with perfect corporate etiquette. 8:46 p.m. The general counsel, Peters, a man who understood which way the wind was blowing, stood up. He ignored his CEO. He walked the length of the table until he was standing beside me. He didn't look at Grant. He spoke directly to me, his voice a low, deferential murmur. "Ms. Marlowe," he said, using my name for the first time all night. "My clients, the board of directors, need to understand the terms. What are the conditions to resolve this situation?" My phone buzzed in my lap. "A text from Mara, they're asking." I didn't speak. I simply unlocked my phone, opened my outbox, and forwarded her the term sheet for the asset purchase. I added Peters to the recipient list. I hit send. Peters' own phone chimed a second later. He looked down, read the subject line, and nodded slowly. "I see," he said. "I'll distribute this to the board." He retreated, a man carrying the terms of his own surrender. 8:53 p.m. Another wave of notifications. This one was different. It wasn't a text or a quiet email. It was a system-generated high-importance alert. A pre-drafted email from Mara's system had been automatically sent to the entire board and the senior leadership. The subject line was 3 terrifying words: "Notice of loan default." The legal grace periods were over. The clock was now ticking toward foreclosure and liquidation. 9:01 p.m. The dam of secrecy broke. The managers at the table started getting frantic texts from their subordinates. The internal company Slack channels were on fire. Someone had leaked the board notice. Someone else had heard a rumor about a sale. The head of PR, who was at the table, was typing frantically, trying to draft a holding statement. A draft message: "Kingswell is currently evaluating a strategic proposal to maximize shareholder value. was accidentally pasted into a company-wide channel. The panic went supernova. 9:07 p.m. In the midst of the chaos, Grant turned to me. The anger, the fear, the pleading, it was all gone. He just looked at me. It was a look of profound and horrified discovery, the look of a man realizing the person he has slept next to for years is a complete and utter stranger, a force he could not comprehend. I met his gaze, then reached for the bottle of mineral water. I calmly refilled my glass. My hand was perfectly, unnervingly steady. 9:12 p.m. My phone rang, an unknown number with a local area code. I answered. Tessa Marlowe. A reporter's voice asked, "This is David Egan from the Ravenport Ledger. We're getting tips about a major event at Kingswell Dynamics, a takeover, a default. Can you comment?" I paused, letting the silence hang for a moment. "I can't speak to speculation," I said, my voice calm and measured. "I will say this, our priority is protecting jobs." I hung up. I had just fired my first public volley. I was the protector. They were the ones who had put the company and its employees at risk. 9:19 p.m. Caldwell, the lead director, stood up once more. He silenced the panicked chatter with a raised hand. "The board has agreed," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent room. "We will convene at 10 p.m. tonight in the Cedar Room." The Cedar Room, the glass-walled conference room on the executive floor, the fishbowl. It was 2 hallways away from where we now sat. The countdown was over. The trial was about to begin. We did not wait for dessert. The procession from the private dining room to the Cedar Room was a silent, funereal march. We left the half-eaten food and overturned chairs behind. Victor Hale and his CFO, Marcus Thorne, were asked to wait in an adjacent office, their faces pale and slack with shock. They were no longer relevant to the proceedings. Grant followed me, walking a few paces behind, a ghost in my wake. I was offered the head of the table. I took it. The 5 independent directors and their general counsel sat opposite me. On the gleaming surface of the mahogany table, I placed my phone and activated the speaker. A clear, calm voice filled the room. "Good evening, members of the board. This is Mara Coulson." I let them absorb the fact that my counsel was already present, already leading the meeting. Then I began. My voice was low, devoid of emotion. I was not there to gloat or to threaten. I was there to present a series of facts and their inevitable consequences. "You have a choice to make," I began, my eyes meeting those of the lead director, Caldwell. "There are 3 doors in front of you. Your decision tonight will determine which one you walk through. I advise you to consider them carefully. Door number 1 is the offer you have in your inbox. It is a clean, orderly asset purchase. My entity, Rookite, will acquire all operating assets of Kingswell Dynamics. We will immediately retire the entirety of the $240 million syndicated loan, deleveraging the company overnight. The existing executive management will be terminated. We will install an interim leadership team, and we will retain a minimum of 92% of the current workforce. The company, in a healthier, more stable form, continues. The employees keep their jobs, the business is saved. This is the door of a structured rescue. I paused, letting the phrase hang in the air. Rescue. Door number 2 is the path of resistance. Should you choose to reject the offer or attempt to delay and renegotiate, I will immediately instruct my counsel to file for a public foreclosure under Article 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code. This is my right as the administrative agent for your defaulted senior debt. A public auction of all company assets will be scheduled to take place in 12 days. At that auction, I will be the primary bidder. I will credit bid the face value of the debt you currently owe me. This means I will acquire your assets for no additional cash outlay. The final outcome is the same. I take control of the business. However, the process will be a public, value-destructive circus that will erase every cent of equity and leave nothing for anyone but the senior creditors. This is the door of a chaotic liquidation. Their faces were grim. They understood the term credit bid. It was a creditor's ultimate trump card. Door number 3, I continued, my voice dropping even lower, is the most foolish. It is the door of litigation. Should you attempt to fight this in court, my position is legally ironclad, as your own counsel has likely already advised you. While you waste money on legal fees, my cash dominion will remain in full effect. Every dollar of your revenue will continue to flow into my account. Your key suppliers will continue to recognize only my authority. You will be unable to make payroll by the end of this week. Within 48 hours, your auditors will be professionally obligated to issue a going concern risk warning, which is a formal declaration that the company is on the verge of failure. Your stock will be halted, then delisted. This is the door of corporate asphyxiation, a slow, painful, and utterly pointless death. I leaned back in my chair. The presentation was complete. Now, for the clarification, I said, my gaze sweeping across their faces. Let me be perfectly clear. I did not build this machine to kill your company. I built it to save the viable business that is trapped inside the failing structure your management has created. I am here to save the business, not the egos. Caldwell was the first to speak, his voice raspy. The terms of the offer, your role, the role of the CEO. My role is irrelevant for now, I answered. Mr. Hale's role, however, is over. He will tender his resignation tonight, effective immediately. There will be no severance, no golden parachute. His contract is nullified by the gross negligence that led to this default. Your current COO, Ms. Albright, will serve as interim CEO to ensure operational continuity. The other board member, Chen Jones, looked at me with an expression that was a mixture of awe and pity. "And your husband?" she asked quietly. "Mr. Wilder." I glanced at Grant for the first time since we'd entered the room. He was sitting in a chair against the wall as far from the table as possible, looking small and broken. "Grant will be afforded the same opportunity as any other employee of the acquired assets," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the glass walls around us. "He is free to apply for a suitable position in the new organization. No preference will be given." Grant flinched. He closed his eyes, the final personal blow having landed. "You seem to have thought this through," Caldwell noted, an understatement of epic proportions. "I have," I said. I opened my laptop and turned it to face them. On the screen was a 60-page slide deck. This is a draft of the transition plan. It contains a detailed 100-day timeline, a schedule for all payroll and benefit payments to ensure no employee misses a paycheck, and the script for a dedicated employee hotline that will go live the moment this agreement is signed. It outlines a clear path to stability. I had given them the problem, and now I was giving them the only solution, a solution so complete, so meticulously planned that it made refusal seem not just unwise but insane. "I have one final condition," I said. "It is the only part of this offer that is to me non-negotiable." They leaned forward. "There will be a mandatory 180-day moratorium on any layoffs affecting non-managerial frontline employees. The people who do the actual work will be protected." With that, I stopped talking. I folded my hands on the table and waited. The silence in the room was immense. It stretched, pulling taut like a wire. I counted the seconds in my head, 10, 15, 20. The only sound was the low hum of the room's ventilation system. I could see them exchanging glances, running the brutal calculus in their minds. They were trapped. Every door led to me. The only choice they had was how much pain they wanted to endure to get there. The fluorescent lights of the conference room reflected off the polished mahogany table, illuminating 5 pale, drawn faces, the faces of men who had spent their lives in boardrooms, making deals and wielding power, who were only now realizing that they were no longer playing the game. They were the game. The clock on the wall read 10 p.m. The air in the cedar room was thin and stale, recycled by a ventilation system that seemed to amplify the sound of every nervous breath. Victor Hale and Marcus Thorne were escorted into the room. They were not invited to sit at the table. They stood behind the seated board members like defendants in a trial they had already lost. Victor, his face blotchy and his suit rumpled, made one last desperate lunge for power. He gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles white. "Listen to me," he began, his voice trying for its old command but emerging as a strained plea. "This is a negotiation tactic, a hostile play. Give me 30 days. I can unwind this. I can call our contacts at the Fed. I can secure a bridge loan. He was cut off. Not by me, but by his own general counsel. Peters didn't even turn around. "It's too late for that, Victor," the lawyer said, his voice flat and exhausted. "The springing liquidity covenant has been breached. The default is active. We have no 30 days, we have minutes." The finality in Peters's voice seemed to break something in the CFO. Marcus Thorne, who had been staring at the floor, suddenly looked up at Caldwell, the head of the audit committee. "It was the deck," he mumbled, his voice thick. "The one Wilder brought me back in March." He was confessing, the words spilling out in a pathetic, unstoppable torrent. It looked plausible, a way to show better margins. "I signed the addendum with Hexagon. I knew the terms were bad, but I thought we could renegotiate later. I needed to polish the EBITDA for the quarter." He had just admitted to securities fraud in a room full of board members. The silence that followed his confession was absolute, broken only by the sharp intake of breath from the man sitting next to him. In that silence, Grant stood up. He didn't look at the board or at his fallen CEO. He looked only at me, his face a ruin of regret. "I'm sorry, Tessa," he said, the words quiet but clear in the still room. "I am so sorry." I met his gaze. I gave him a single, shallow nod. It was an acknowledgement, not an absolution. He slowly sat back down, a man utterly erased. My turn. I slid a single sheet of paper from a leather folder and pushed it into the center of the table. It slid across the polished mahogany, coming to a stop directly in front of Caldwell. "That is a side letter," I announced. "It is an addendum to the asset purchase agreement you have in your possession. It contains one clause." I let them all lean in to read it. It stated that, contingent on the board's full approval of the APA tonight, I would irrevocably waive my right to pursue an Article 9 foreclosure sale. If, however, this meeting concluded without a signed resolution, that offer was withdrawn. At midnight tonight, in less than 2 hours, my counsel was instructed to automatically file the UCC-1 notice. The public foreclosure process would begin. It was the dagger on the table, a choice between a clean private amputation and a messy public execution. "And to be clear about our capacity to close," Mara Colson's voice cut in from the speakerphone, sharp as glass, "I have Julian Croft, managing partner of North Harbor Capital, on the line to confirm his fund's commitment." A new voice, confident and clear, joined the call. "This is Julian Croft. I am confirming that North Harbor Capital has executed a binding letter of support for Rookite Acquisition's purchase of Kingswell Dynamics assets. The funds are fully committed and are available for immediate wire transfer upon the satisfaction of the conditions outlined in the term sheet." The money was real, the threat was real, the timeline was absolute. I saw Caldwell and Chen Jones lean their heads together. Their whispers were barely audible, but in the hyper-focused quiet of the room, I caught the words. "He did this," Chen Jones murmured, her voice tight with fury. "Victor did this?" Caldwell nodded, his face set like stone. "Save the jobs first," he whispered back. "We have to save the jobs. It's the only move we have left." He straightened up. The decision had been made. I decided to give them the final push. "To facilitate this," I said, "and to demonstrate my commitment to an orderly transition, I am prepared to sign a 48-hour, no-shop provision giving this board exclusive negotiating rights." A few of them looked up, a flicker of surprise in their eyes. "A concession. I will sign that exclusivity agreement," I continued, "the moment I receive a countersigned copy of Mr. Hale's letter of termination." Victor Hale exploded. He surged forward, his hands flailing. "You!" he screamed, his face purple with rage. "You have no right! Who the hell do you think you are?" I did not stand. I did not raise my voice. I looked up at this titan of industry, this man who had dismissed me with a laugh just a few hours ago, and I delivered the final, simple truth. "I am the person, Victor," I said calmly, "who authorizes the release of funds to your payroll account, and at this moment, I am the only person who can make sure your 3,000 employees get paid on Friday." It was over. The rage drained from Victor's face, leaving behind a gray, empty husk. He stumbled backward, silent. The general counsel, Peters, let out a long, slow sigh. It was the sound of a war ending. He reached down into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick document bound in a blue cover. He placed it in the center of the table with a soft, final thud. The corporate resolution, ready for a signature. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, in the empty, silent hallway, the building's air conditioning kicked in. It was a low, steady, mechanical drone, the sound of a pen scratching endlessly across a page. The resolution lay in the center of the table like a tombstone. There was no more debate. Caldwell, the lead director, picked up a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen, uncapped it, and signed his name with a steady, deliberate stroke. The document was passed to Chen Jones, who signed without hesitation. One by one, the board members affixed their signatures. The scratching of the pen nib on the thick paper was the only sound in the room. Finally, the document was pushed in front of Victor Hale, along with a single-page letter of termination. His hand shook so violently he could barely hold the pen. He scribbled his signature, a jagged, angry scar of ink. The clock on the wall read 10:27 p.m. It was done. My phone chimed. It was an email from Mara with the subject line, "Bring down certificate for signature." I opened the secure document. It was a formal declaration that all conditions precedent to the closing had been met. I applied my electronic signature. The moment I did, a process was initiated deep within the bank's servers. My cash dominion, the iron fist that had been strangling the company, instantly relaxed its grip. It didn't disappear. It transformed. The hostile takeover mechanism was now transition mode, a tool to ensure a smooth and orderly transfer of financial control. The funds were no longer locked. They were simply guided by a new hand. The time was 10:29 p.m. There was a soft knock on the conference room door. A uniformed courier entered, holding a large, stiff cardboard envelope. He looked at the assembled faces, then walked directly to me. "For Rukite acquisition," he said, handing me the package. I didn't need to open it. I knew what it was, the schedule of assets, a meticulously detailed inventory of every single thing I now owned, from their server farms to their patents to the ergonomic chairs in their break rooms. As I took the envelope, the light from the overhead fluorescents caught the glossy, embossed seal, making it glitter for a brief moment. The time was 10:31 p.m. I turned my head slightly to look at Grant. He was still sitting against the wall, a spectator at the demolition of his own life. Our eyes met across the gulf of the room. "I chose the company," I said, my voice quiet but firm, meant only for him, not anyone's ego. He gave a slow, broken nod, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Peters, the general counsel, slid the final massive document in front of me, the asset purchase agreement. I took the same pen Caldwell had used. Its weight felt substantial, historic. I turned to the final page and began to sign, my signature flowing smoothly across the line, Tessa Marlowe, and for the first time I let the titles flow behind it. Chief Executive Officer, Glass Key Labs, Inc., and Managing Member, Rukite Acquisition, LLC. My two identities, the hidden and the ghost, finally united on a single line. The time was 10:33 p.m. As my pen formed the last letter of my name, another automated process I had scheduled hours before was triggered. An email, simple and direct, was blasted to the inboxes of all 3,000 Kingswell Dynamics employees. The subject, an important message regarding business continuity. The body of the email was just 2 sentences. "Your monthly salary scheduled for this Friday is secure and will be paid on time. Your work continues as normal under the new leadership." I had fulfilled my promise. The time was 10:34 p.m. I placed the pen down on the table. The click of metal on wood was soft, but it echoed in the silence. A moment later, my phone lying face up on the table emitted a single, crisp electronic beep. The sound of a federally insured wire transfer confirming its settlement. The sound of money, power, and ownership changing hands in an instant. The deal was closed. The company was mine. The time was 10:35 p.m. The scene dissolved. I was no longer in the cold, glass-walled conference room. I was back in the private dining room. The debris of the aborted dinner was still there, a testament to the chaos. Most of the executives had already scattered, disappearing into the night to lick their wounds and call their lawyers. Only a few remained, Victor, Grant, and me. A waiter, either oblivious or supremely professional, entered the room. He walked directly to me, holding a small round dish. "Your crème brûlée, madam," he said, placing it gently in front of me. I looked at the dessert, a perfect glassy sheet of caramelized sugar, as smooth and dark as the hotel windows, covering a pool of rich, pale custard. I picked up my spoon. I tapped it once on the surface. A network of fine cracks appeared. I pressed down. The sugar shattered with a sharp, satisfying crack. the sound of something solid and brittle giving way completely. I scooped up a spoonful of the warm custard and the sharp, sweet shards of burnt sugar. Before I took a bite, I looked up. Victor Hale was standing by the door, his shoulders slumped, his face a hollow mask. He was watching me. I smiled. A small, genuine smile. "Little startup," I said, the words a soft murmur. Then I looked directly into his empty eyes and I pushed the final, perfect blade in. "Just bought your company. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let me know. We can share our thoughts and connect with each other. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like.